So, welcome back. And we just talked about how level of intelligence or how level of development of a civilization would also affect the level of intelligence of the individuals or of the group. We talked about how a person from a rather undeveloped environment or civilization level would be overwhelmed with the flow of information that we would have in our modern world today, and how a modern person from our world could be overwhelmed by a flow of information from, for example, a cyberpunk world. So this brings us to the level of development of our intelligent species or our sentient species. Let me just quickly see if I am recording. Uh, just a second. No, I haven't actually resumed recording, so caught it nicely. Recording in progress. Okay, now we are recording, and let me just share the screen with you again. Okay, so let's move on then from this. So what do we mean when we say level of development? And again, we have only ourselves to consider in this regard, because human civilization is basically the only civilization that we know. But of course, this has different levels of development in different areas of the world. So even though we are tempted or we are taught that Western civilization is the basis of all this, it is actually not. There are lots of different civilizations that sprang up in different geographical locations around the world at different times. But in today's world, these are pretty much merged together. And we can say that the dominant culture in the world today is the Western culture, with the efforts of Europe in colonization and recently in the United States in cultural domination. So, but when we generally think about it, before these modern times, it was pretty much a similar progression all around the world. So we had the Stone Age. What we call Lower Paleolithic is from the time that we start to define ourselves as humans from our ancestors, apart from our ancestors, primates, and this is around 3 million years before Christ, BC, to 300,000 BC, and this is when we actually started to stand upright. Erectus means upright, erect, and Homo erectus means human standing. So, and this is, we saw last week about species names and genus naming. So this is our this was the name of our species back then. We were Homo erectus. We started to stand up and hit each other with stones and sticks. Then comes the Middle Paleolithic, from 300,000 to 50,000, and this is the early Homo sapiens, which means we started to sharpen things in order to stick each other more efficiently. And then comes the Upper Paleolithic, which is from 50,000 to 12,000. Again, these are very rough numbers because we are trying to learn about these from archaeological dig sites and very, very old bones and other stuff. So scientists look at bones, for example, and see that the bone is broken by a blunt force impact or by a sharp object, and they decide the age of the bone, and they say, oh, it's around this part. So people learned about sharp stones at this point because this bone is broken by something sharp and hard. This is how we determine things. We don't know these for sure. We don't have a time machine to go there, unfortunately. So, but after this, in the Neolithic times, things start to get interesting because this is actually when we started to form the basis of civilization, let's say, because this is the time that we started to settle down. And rather than move around all the time like animals do, we started to settle down and create settlements. And how this came about is the reason we did that actually, as our level of intelligence increased. Let me just, okay. as our level of intelligence increased, we realized that we can put plants on the ground and grow them, so we can grow crops. Oh, this is very convenient because we don't have to forage for food anymore or try to hunt animals. But this means staying in this place, because it means we have to stay with them and we have to watch them grow. We have to cultivate them. We have to defend them from other animals and other humans. This means we have to stay in one place. We can no longer go around whenever we want, wherever we want, and stay in caves and such. So we have to stay there. And this in turn created another problem, because since we are going to stay here and watch these crops, and we are most probably aren't in a mountainous place because we are growing these in fields, we have to build a house to live in as shelter. This brought the need to build shelters of some kind. So we had to build a very basic child's house, of course without a chimney at the beginning, but you get the idea. So this means we have crops that we will grow here, and we have a house that we will stay in around that. So this is a settlement. And in time, of course, another person came in and built another settlement and said, oh, I'm going to grow my crops here, and we can grow them together. And then another person came in and maybe said, hey guys, I cannot grow crops like you do, but I can build very nice spears. So would you mind if I stay here with you and I guard you from all the animals and other nasty people, and you give me a part of the crop? And these people said, okay, we are okay with that because this guy will be guarding them. And here we have the very basic of a settlement. This is a village, basically. And people started to form villages like this. And in time, these villages started to grow in number, in population, and they started to form cities. And after some time, we are moving in this timeline down. Someone came out and say, they were joined by other people who can build clothes, they can sew clothes, who can build shoes and other tools. So they started to form a community. And soon after, someone said, guys, we have built such a city and this is good, but we should have some rules inside this area that we are all living. The very basic one is that we shouldn't kill each other, or we should have a sort of punishment when we kill each other. We shouldn't damage each other's tools and blah blah blah. So this in turn created a ruling class, some people that are devoted to ruling. But what matters for us is that we created city states. So these are basically states, so countries within themselves that have rules in a city. So what happens outside is not their concern. If someone gets killed here, they don't care, because it didn't happen within their boundaries. Of course, if it's their citizen, that would mean something. But other than that, outside the city is no man's land. They don't care. And there's another one here, for example, another city. And there's another city here. So these are how city-states are formed. And after some time, after these cities became big enough, some of them even built walls around them to protect themselves, these city-states, but they had to have fields outside, crop fields outside their borders. So they decided to protect those areas as well, naturally, because it is their food source. And then the idea of borders came to be. Territories. So these are basically, this is this country's territory, and this area is, for example, this city-state's territory, and another city-state is, let's do purple for it, this one. And of course they would fight with each other. This city would fight with this one, and this one would fight with this one for resources. But this is how, when one of the city-states manages to dominate others, we have kingdoms, and we have a king in one of them. So this is how our society evolved from simple settlements to villages to cities, city-states. Every city is a country within itself, into kingdoms. And they could have differing laws. For example, in Babylon, where agriculture is very, very important, it's the cradle of our civilization as human civilization. Breaking someone else's agricultural tools was punishable by death. So you would break their tools and they would kill you. Other people would sentence you to death because it is that important in that environment for feeding. Anyway, after this, as this Neolithic age progresses, we come to proto-history. And when we say history, we mean writing. When we start writing things, when we start recording things, we talk about history, starting from then on. Everything before that, everything before history is what we try to understand with archaeology. We look at pots, we look at houses, we look at what we dig up. We try to understand the pictures, for example, on pottery. We try to see the jewelry and try to understand what was happening. But as history starts to progress, as writing is introduced, we are learning what those people were doing from the words. This is the information in the very pure sense. This is raw information. They are telling us the concepts with writing. Of course, this may not be always correct. For example, in Egypt, ancient Egypt, scribes would record everything that the pharaohs did, but the pharaoh was considered to be the son of gods. So when they wrote something, they were trying to show the pharaoh as an omnipotent being. So they would write things like he destroyed 100 persons with a swing of his sword, things like that. On the other hand, in Babylon, the people, the scribes in Babylon, because of their spirituality or their religion, they considered what they write as some kind of report to gods. They were writing annals, and these annals were the reports they were giving to gods actually, and they wouldn't think of lying to gods because the gods already know what's going on. So the reports that were kept in Babylon were actually correct. They were, how do we know they are correct? Because they make sense when you cross-reference them with other foundings that you have about that age. And then we have Bronze Age. Again, this is around 3,300 to 1,000. But for example, China entered this age a lot earlier than Europe. So these start to vary around a little bit. And then we went to Iron Age. Then we came to ancient history, started with writing. And this is, as you see, we went on to AD after date. So BC is before Christ and AD is after date. I don't know why they called one Christ and the other one date. I don't know. I don't know why this is not AC, but it is just some kind of common terminology. So post-classical history is the expansion of civilization and development of trade relations. Again, this is loosely around the Western civilization, so we don't have to take these dates as a basis. We are not trying to dissect human civilization. We are just trying to see how our civilization progressed. And then comes the modern history. Early modern is after Renaissance. Late modern is after industrialization. And contemporary is kind of what we have today. And when you think about all this development, we have a certain progression in technology, culture, and history. And we will look at all these in their respective lectures, by the way. We will have a lecture about history, we will have a lecture about technology, we will have a lecture about art. But this is pretty much how our civilization was shaped. And as I said, when you think about us as biological beings, our culture is very much dominated by what we can sense and what we can do. As I said, colors, bright colors, for example, are very important, especially in early cultures and still today, because we can see color. Music is very important because we can hear and communicate with sounds. Stage arts are very important because we communicated with body language and using our appendages, namely our legs and arms, by waving them around and making shapes with our fingers. This contributed to our history and to our culture. So, an, an example of how we can put these into games, if we ever want to, is strategy games like Civilization, because in such games, these are actually steps that you take. For example, Civilization 6 divides these into these categories. And this is not saying that these are the absolute best categories, because Sid Meier is a genius in this regard, or Civilization is a very long ongoing series, but this is how they did it. And it's kind of a neat classification. There is the ancient era of civilization, there is classical, where the first technological advances are being made in form of mechanical devices. There is the medieval era, where the mechanical devices, the technology gets very practical. So when we think about medieval times, we think that technology had stopped completely, and it is not so at all. Science has stopped progressing, maybe, but technology did not, because different siege weaponry were invented, different types of armors were invented, and all those happened in the medieval era. And then came the Renaissance, which is an advancement, a large advancement in science and technology and arts and philosophy, for that matter, also spirituality. In all aspects, Renaissance was a very big area of expansion. And when you think about it, Renaissance in turn brought colonialism, because the technological advancements made in Renaissance area made it possible for people to go further with ships, to see where they are going with ships, to sail the seas and go bugger off other people, other peaceful living people, and enslave them. So Renaissance was a very big motivational advancement. And then came the industrial era, machinery, industrial revolution. Then modern era and civilization, for example, named the next era as atomic. But we, for example, today name this era as information age, because we are more digital than we are practical or mechanical. But in Fallout, for example, this industrial era led to atomic era directly, because Fallout is stuck in post 50s aesthetic style, and it is as if the other advances were never made in the Fallout world. The computer technology is very underdeveloped, but atomic technology is very well developed. So they power robots with atomic nuclear reactors. They power cars with nuclear reactors, but they don't have computers that have 4 megabytes of RAM. Another thing, for example, you see something like this is the Matrix movie trilogy. I didn't see the last one. I cannot comment about that. But when you think about the Matrix trilogy, you think about, why don't the robots use nuclear energy to power themselves? Why do they have to harvest humans for very, very inefficient heat energy? I mean, which is heat is a byproduct of our biology. So we only dump the heat that we don't use. We radiate the heat that we don't use, and they harvest it to fuel themselves, which is very inconvenient. They have to maintain and grow billions and billions of humans to be able to keep themselves, which maybe at 1,000 nuclear reactors could very well do. And when you think about that world building, probably, maybe, that world doesn't have nuclear energy at all. It wasn't invented, so the machines don't have access to it. You can think of it that way. So now we talked about these, and we will sum all of these up. All these things that we did here: anatomy, feeding, reproduction, manipulating the environment, sensors, actuators. We talked about these guys, and we talked about the important points. Now, there will come a time that we will have to actually create these intelligent things. And there we have a certain number of tropes that we have in our hands. So probably the thing that we do will fall into one of several categories. These are certain tropes that are present. And I will show you this website. Here it is. Oh, actually, I want to talk to you about this. These are the guys that are Neanderthals. These are other types of humans. They are actually a different race than us, that we probably murdered around 40,000 years ago. So Neanderthals aren't Homo sapiens. They are a different species of human. So they would. This is a picture of how they would look probably today if they could advance to the modern age, but we didn't let them, because they were probably more intelligent and more peaceful than Homo sapiens, and we were more savage and cruel, so we murdered all of them, and they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. So this is, for example, actually I will come back to this in a few minutes, but here we have ourselves a website, TV Tropes. If you don't know it, tread very carefully. This is more addictive than Wikipedia. You go from one end and you can just read things for hours without knowing. But there are certain tropes that are very well documented here about sentient species here. So, and you will recognize most of them right away. The first one that we see, if they are not humans, is the wise elder race trope. And these are the elves that we all know, Tolkien's elves namely. They tend to live much longer than humans do, sometimes hundreds or thousands of years, and they are very much more calculated, and they are wise. They are very cold-blooded. So these are basically what humanity aspires to be one day, if logic prevails. And of course they have some variations, because these are, I have shown you these before, these are elves from Dark Sun, which are a variation of this wise elder race. But since Dark Sun likes to turn things around, these are not very wise and these are not elder, but they are still following the same elf trope. So elf is a very dominant trope in all fantasy and sci-fi creations. These are sea elves from the Dragonlance. They are the Dargonesti. In Dragonlance, elves are named according to their not subspecies, but their subculture. So there is the Sylvanesti and Coelnesti, regular elves that we know. And these are Dargonesti, that are sea elves. And there is Kagonesti, which are very much like these guys. They are wood elves, basically. They hide inside the woods, and they shoot anyone that comes near them. But the wise elder race trope is not limited to fantasy, because we have the space version. These are called the space elves. They are wise, they are elder, they are in space, and most of the time they have pointy ears. They use the elf trope to the point of being pointy. This guy is not. So this is, as you very well probably know, a Vulcan. Spock is actually half Vulcan, but he is the personification of Vulcans in many Star Trek series. So Vulcans in Star Trek lore are actually the people who discover humans when they create warp technology. So one person, one inventor creates the warp drive, and he uses the warp drive for the first time. And the Vulcan ship that is nearby notices this. Oh, someone has used the warp drive. Let's go check it out. They go and check it out. They see humanity, and at that time, humanity is surviving a post-atomic error phase. So there is a widespread worldwide atomic war, and after that, very strict religious organizations have come to power, and the world is basically in a recovery state. And Vulcans discover Earth in this state, and they advise humanity for a century. And after 1 century, humanity says, "Screw this, we are going to space on our own." But in that case, in that regard, these are the ultimate space elves because they are better than humans. They use logic, they don't use their emotions, and they make decisions based on logic alone, and they guide humans. They are better than humans in every way, as depicted. So you can say the Vulcans are the first space elves. This guy is from Stargate series. So this is Thor, actually, Supreme Commander Thor. And in Stargate, these guys are the people that Scandinavian people thought were gods. So this is Thor, and he came to people, and they say, "Oh, Thor, this is the Thor in Northern mythologies." But they are, again, wise, and they advise humans about stuff. And these guys, as you probably know, are from Avatar. They are not wise or elder in that regard, but they are very much like wood elves. So they possess elven traits. They are nimble, they are fast, things like that. And they actually represent kind of Native Americans in a narrative sense. But when you think about it, these are actually space elves as well. And moving on from space elves, the other very common trope is the proud warrior race. So these guys are very proud and very warrior, as you see from all of them. In D&D, we see the dwarves as the dominant ones in this. For dwarves, D&D dwarves, duty and honor are very important. And actually, there is a quote. Let me just try to recall that. It says, "Being a dwarf means doing your duty even if it makes you miserable, especially if it makes you miserable." So for dwarves, duty is above everything else, and if it makes you miserable in the process, so much better. And we also have minotaurs in this sense. Minotaurs, as you may know, is actually a single creature from Greek mythology. Minotaur is Hercules' brother. As expected, Zeus is the father, because Zeus fathers half the pantheon in Greek mythology. So, but in D&D, they have been turned into actually a race, and later a player race. But for example, minotaurs are very much like dwarves with kind of a sailor template slapped on, because dwarves hate water, they live underground, but minotaurs are sailors, but they are also very proud. And an iteration of the Minotaur is the Tauren from World of Warcraft. So Tauren is an iteration on Minotaur. They are, again, bovine in nature. They are cows, basically. But they take, for example, very Native American template on them. So they are shamanic. And they are actually peaceful, but since they are very large, they are very effective in battle. They can use magic, blah, blah, blah. But again, they are warrior and they are proud. And these guys here, the Klingon, are actually the space equivalent of the proud. They are the space archetype. They are the prime space trope for this guy, for this trope. Again, they are very proud and very warrior. They value honor to the extent that their language doesn't have a word for good. So they cannot say good day to each other. They say honorable day. So they cannot say good morning. They say honorable morning, because for them, being good is being honorable. If you are honorable, you are good. If you've lost your honor, you are not good. And they have, for example, multiple copies of their organs. Each of their organs are redundant down to their brains. So they don't die easily. When one of their organs fail, the other one takes over for that function. And they are also called, in the term of Klingons, there is a trope called rubber forehead aliens, and it comes from the fact that in after 50s and 60s, especially in Star Trek, creating an alien isn't a very easy process. And when you have an alien in your cast that should talk and walk around, the most practical thing you can do to distinguish them from humans is to put some uh, latex or silicone implant on them somewhere on their bodies, preferably their faces, because we cannot see the rest of their bodies. They are all clothed, and call them an alien. So this is why they are called rubber forehead aliens in TV tropes. But as a species trope, we have this proud warrior race as well. And then we can mesh them together and then create the wise elder proud warrior race. And this is a very nice example. The Protoss from StarCraft. They are wise, they are elder, they are proud, and they are warriors. So, for example, they have become a certain kind of trope as well. They have highly refined aesthetics, so very good design in this case. They master pure energy. They have psychic powers, preferably. And this is an interesting one: endless contempt for humanity, slowly giving way to respect. So this, in terms of narrative, they slowly start to learn how humans are actually good, blah blah blah. But in this sense, we see that when we mix tropes together, we can get another one. And then, for example, as an example, we have the sufficiently advanced alien trope. In this case, sufficiently advanced means advanced enough to move the plot along. So these guys are basically indistinguishable from gods. And for example, this is Q from Star Trek The Next Generation. He's actually a very annoying guy and a very, very advanced alien, to the point that he can do whatever he wants. And actually, for example, at some point, the Enterprise, the starship, is in danger from an asteroid, and he suggests just change the gravitational constant and get away from it. So it shows us that for Q, changing the gravitational constant of the universe at some point is a very trivial matter. So when we see this trope, we see that these aliens can do whatever they want. So they are not good NPCs or player characters. They are plot devices. And this guy is from Stargate, I believe, and they are a race that are so powerful they pose as gods to enslave other races. And this is interesting. This is from Star Trek, the animated series from 1969, I think. This guy is actually an alien, but at one time it came to Earth and posed as Quetzalcoatl, the gods of the Mayan god. And I think he says to the Enterprise, well, I will go back and the entire world will worship me, and something like that. I don't recall very well. But this is another trope that we have. We have sufficiently advanced aliens. And another trope that I want to show you, finally, is the trader trope. This is actually a little bit boring because this will drive the point of the next slide. But these guys, these are Ferengi from Star Trek. They are traders, so much so that their spiritual beliefs include a golden auction house in the afterlife. They are that much traders. So actually, even in one episode, one of a Ferengi captain wants to take revenge from Jean-Luc Picard, Enterprise's captain, and he is stopped by other Ferengi because what he does is not profitable. So he's seeking revenge because his son died in an accident. But other Ferengi stop him and take his command because they think what he does is not profitable. And that is grounds enough to stop him from taking his revenge. So, and these guys are goblins from Harry Potter, and these are the guys that I don't know the species of, but they run the Trade Federation in Star Wars. So they are so much traders that they run the Trade Federation, for example. But this will bring me to my next point, because when we lean so heavily into a trait of a species, we can create a one-dimensional species. So these guys have only their uh, advanced trait abilities to show for themselves. They are not, their culture is not explored in any other way, or even if it is explored, it is always connected to this trade thing. So we don't see any other aspect of their culture, or their culture doesn't have any other aspect. And this can actually subtract from world building because, for example, there are cultures on our on Earth, civilizations and cultures that are very well uh, developed trade relations, and they are trade savvy, let's say, especially around Mediterranean when trade was first uh, developed this much. But we know that those cultures, those trader cultures, actually have lots of other traits to them. So when you create a one-dimensional species like this, you take the risk. When you say a species or a culture is very brave, and you don't put anyone who is afraid into any of it, you actually create a cutout species. We call this a cutout species. So they have just one dimension. They are dimensional. I don't know how it is properly pronounced. But the danger that we have is that that culture that we create, that species that we create, that race that we create, will not have any depth to them, and this will subtract from our world building. And you see this a lot actually in characters in TV series, not so much so in species, but you see one character is a fan favorite in a series, for example, and there's a trait that makes them favorite. But as the series progresses, as new seasons come out, you see that that character gets reduced to just that single trait. The best example I can think of is Joey from Friends. I'm sure you know about Friends. I mean, maybe you haven't watched the series, but in the first season, Joey is a character that is not very bright. He's not stupid. He just doesn't care and know about stuff that much. So he's a little bit absent-minded and uh, not that smart, but he's not stupid. But by the end of the 10th series, Joey is a character that cannot deduce anything and is just reduced to a character that makes facial expressions when he discovers something, and he discovers something only when people say it openly, for example. This is how fan service can deteriorate a character, and this can happen for cultures as well. You keep propagating the elven trait of being wise and proud, for example, or wise and elder, and they may have nothing else left from their other traits, or maybe they have no other traits to begin with in your world if you don't show them. Uh, so we will go into, now we talked about species a lot. I should have had a large slide here, but I don't. So we will directly go into relations between species. How does interaction work out between different species? So we can have interaction in two ways. Our species can coexist, or our species, our two species, let's say, can be in conflict. So when we say coexist, we have three possible scenarios. We can have a scenario of mutual benefit. So both cultures, both species can benefit from each other. This is this is best manifested as in form of trade. So if two cultures have trade relations with each other and they are not fighting, this means they are coexisting and they have mutual benefit. One maybe supplies something like metals and the other one supplies things like cotton, for example. I don't know. When the relationship, the interaction is symbiotic, it means one of them is benefiting from the other one, but the first one doesn't have anything to gain at all. So it means you have one culture and the other one is taking from it, but this culture isn't affected or doesn't care. So it's kind of like when you give technology to another species or culture and they develop, but you are so much advanced that you don't lose anything from it. You don't care about what they would do, because what could they do? I mean, you are only giving them a portion of what you have, kind of. Actually, this is a good example. The puppeteers I talked about earlier, the three-legged, two-headed guy, two-eyed guys, they have very advanced teleportation technology, but so much that they can move planets with them. But they give only very basic teleportation technology to other species. So they give teleportation chambers, and you have to go into one chamber and come out the other. This is the technology that they are willing to give to others, willing to sell to other species, but they themselves conserve the ability to teleport planets at will, and they don't give it away. So even though it includes some sort of trade, this could be a symbiotic relationship because they don't lose anything from giving this. And then there is parasitic relationship. This is when one culture takes from the other and this culture loses in return. And we can see this very well in our history in colonialism, because when the British Empire went to colonize, and the Europe actually led by British Empire colonized around the world, they actually took away from the cultures that they colonized in India, in Native America, Australia, and Africa. So they basically went to those countries. They started to take the resources and bring them back, and they did not have a mutual relationship with them. Actually, even so much so that during Second World War, I believe, there was a big drought in India, and people didn't have any food to eat. But England didn't care and just kept taking resources away for their war effort, and millions of people died in India because of starvation. But Britain just didn't care. So this is a very good example of a parasitic relationship between two cultures. Now, when we come to active conflict, we can have cultural conflict. So there may be two cultures that don't like each other, but it's just that they don't like each other, and that's it. So this is some sort of race. We can call this racism. Of course, it doesn't have to be about race, because when you think about it, even in today's world, even countries that are neighbors can have racism towards each other, even though we are not different races. We are all Homo sapiens. So this is, when we say racism, we don't always mean race. We say in the broader sense. But we can have a state of Cold War, and we actually have a period in our history that is literally named Cold War. This is when the cultures don't actively fight each other, but they try to sabotage each other. And then we have the good old war, where they are fighting. And there is this condition of stalemate. Stalemate is when two sides are effectively equals, so they cannot harm each other. But if they could, they would. This is called a stalemate. So two cultures can be in these kind of conflict interactions. And the best example that we have is the elves versus dwarves thing, because it's universal in all fantasy genres. So elves don't like dwarves don't like elves. Why don't they like each other? Well, that doesn't have a universal answer, because every world is different, but it can be cultural, because elves are from basically woodland creatures and dwarves are mountain creatures, so they don't see eye to eye in many aspects, so they don't like each other. Or it can be a cold war or war in world's history where they fought each other and there was some bitterness left in the historical sense. But for conflict, we should have a reason. What is the reason for any of these conflicts to arise? So it can be physical, to the sense that one of them is eating the other. For example, this is from Dark Sun, and these are tree cranes. I should have talked to you about them before. They have compound eyes, and they have two legs, but they have a civilization, which would suggest that their civilization wouldn't be so much on color and shape, but more on movement, maybe dancing. But the point here is they like to eat elves because elves taste good. So in turn, it is very natural that these two species don't like each other because, I mean, why are we running away from them? Because they eat us. That is a very strong motivation not to like them, right? So in our world, if we don't count cannibalism, which is not an accepted idea, we don't eat other sentient species. So we don't have such an access of comparison, but this can actually exist. This can happen in our worlds. For example, in Old Man's War, in John Scalzi's novel, humanity is in war with different species of aliens, and some of them bring their cooks to battle because they like to eat humans. And they, after the battle, they round up any prisoners and they eat them, and they even actually start human farms from the prisoners so they can eat humans continuously, for example. This is a theme explored in that novel, and this is something that exists in Dark Sun. But since we don't eat any other sentient species, sentient in the sense of a consciousness, I'm not going to go into vegetarianism or veganism here. It is not our subject. So, but we don't have that kind of thing. So this is something that can happen. And there can be cultural reasons, traditions, different in traditions or racism. There can be historic events that create this kind of cultural conflict. And it can be economic. So, for example, in our world history, almost all the wars that have been fought or are being fought are about resources. So unless we are, as humans, unless we have a need for resources, we don't fight with each other. And that makes sense. I mean, even when you look at today's war, the war that we are having in Ukraine today, it's about resources. And even when you look at history, I mean, when you take the example of Troy was a city-state in today's Çanakkale, Dardanelles, and legend has it that king of Troy, Priamos, had a son, Paris, and Paris one day encountered three goddesses who were trying to decide which one of them was more beautiful. This is Greek mythology. One of them is Athena, one of them is Hera, and one of them is Aphrodite, if I remember correctly. And they want Paris to be a judge for them. And they each offer Paris something if he chooses them as the most beautiful. That is a very interesting beauty contest. But Athena, I think, promises victory over everything. Hera promises riches, and Aphrodite promises the love of a very beautiful woman. And Paris chooses Aphrodite. And then he goes to Greece. He visits Greece and he falls in love with king's wife, Helena. I think her name was Helena. And he kidnaps Helena and brings him back to Troy. And the entirety of Greece, along with Sparta, which we know from the movie 300, which made them famous, and the Halo, but the entire of Greece comes to fight Troy. They make a siege to get Helen, not Helena, sorry, Helen, to get Helen back. Now, this is what Homer told us in Iliad. This is the epic of Troy. So this is how poets told us about the historical event. But what we know is that it was actually a war fought for the riches of Troy. So the gold specifically. So this tells us something. Our history tells stories in certain ways, but our wars in the world have always been war for resources of some sort, war over water, war over gas, over oil, war over gold maybe, but it is some kind of resource that we want and we fight for it. Now, this can very well be the case for our cultures as well. So, this is actually what I'm going to cover today, but I want to take a slow sneak peek into the further future lectures, because we will have a series of them. So we will talk a little bit about culture in the upcoming few weeks, 5 or 6 weeks. So when we talk about elements of culture, we can talk about the military elements, the civil elements, trade. We can talk about the science that makes a culture, the philosophical elements and spiritual elements. And as I said, we will have a different lecture for each of these. But the thing to say, the thing that I should mention beforehand, before going into this, that culture is not something that we can build piece by piece in a methodical way, because culture is more like timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. It is all connected. I mean, everything we do in the world is connected. Biology is connected to climate. Climate is connected to cosmology. Cosmology, in turn, connects to atmosphere. Atmosphere connects to biology again, and ecosystems and anatomies of the creatures and the intelligence, types of intelligence that they develop and the cultures they develop. But in this, when we are taking apart cultures and seeing what makes them tick, we will have to jump between all of these all the time. That is what we have to consider. And then there is something that shouldn't be here. I mean, I was going to talk about this in later lectures, but geography, for example, affects it. But we see the reflections of culture in all areas of a civilization. We see it in architecture, the way people or the individuals dress, their cuisine, what they eat, how they eat it, the type of government, the everyday items they use, the weapons they use, or the jewelries they adorn themselves with, the customs and rituals, the rules, the laws, all of them. So this is, in the following few weeks, we will go about these things and these things. So let me just stop sharing the screen. Okay, so that is it for this week, and thank you for watching me.